a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal a sin-sick soul. Sometimes I grow discouraged, I think my work's in vain, but then the Holy Spirit refines my soul again. Oh, there is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole.
I would say really slavery is the main cause of the Civil War.
The Civil War, there are several reasons, but I believe a big reason was the issue of slavery that was going on. At that time you had the North and you had the South who were basically disagreeing with how slavery should be ran in the country, or even if it should be going on, period. And so because of that, you had that split and people couldn't get along. People couldn't work it out. And so you had the Civil War that broke out eventually.
Depends on who you talk to. And that's kind of the answer I give to people, if not that we talk about the origins of the Civil War here too much. But it can either be states' rights, slavery, pissed off people in the North, who knows?
I often do get the question, well, what caused the war? What's the single cause of the war? And I can't give a single cause. I typically tell visitors that it is an umbrella. It's an economic umbrella. Just as in many wars today, economics is one of the key factors.
I say slavery was the main cause of the Civil War.
To my way of thinking, there certainly were several reasons for the Civil War. There were tariff differences, state rights, you always hear the state rights, and the slavery, of course.
Ostensibly states' rights. For a lot of people, slavery was a hot button issue. And those are the main two things that...
I really feel though that if you look at any issue that someone brings up that is not slavery, you can tie it right back into slavery. You'll find that everything is connected into that central cause, really.
The Civil War was caused by the continual conflict over the institution of slavery. That was the central cause of the Civil War, and it led to everything else.
Slavery has to be the central focus, because I think slavery was the one issue that by 1860 the radicals on both sides were no longer willing to really compromise.
It was the disagreement, the inability to reach a common understanding on how to deal with the issue of slavery, and then, as Alan Evans notes, that ultimately underlying that is the racial issue, but how it manifested itself was as slavery, and what was going to be the future of the nation relative to the institution of slavery.
Well, I believe what caused the Civil War is the nation's struggle to separate itself, to finally start to do what's right. Northerners did not agree with the practices of the South, and the South declared their own independence. They said that we have rights as a state that the federal government cannot encroach upon, which could be true in certain instances, but there are some rights of basic humans, of people that were born here in the United States. And these men and women who were enslaved were born here in the United States. They have rights as people.
That without slavery the war would not have occurred. We're all grateful it turned out the way it did, but there is this messy, complex mixture of state versus federal control, local versus federal control, that rears its ugly head, and not too infrequently in American history.
Jefferson calls it the fire bell in the night. You know, this is going to be what splits the country, he says.
We talk about the Civil War we don't talk about slavery so much. Even in our history books, slavery is just, it's mentioned, it's talked about, but it's never really addressed for those kids to understand what slaves went through and what that meant to people. How would you feel if it was you?
I don't think they could negotiate slavery at all, and I think that basically is the cause of the war. But the other issues certainly could have been taken care of without war, for crying out loud.
Of course, a lot of individuals that come here in Georgia, that come out for the day, that live locally, prescribe to the states' rights method. That's a given in the South, because Southerners, and again, me speaking from on a personal level, is that we're not going to be apologetic. That this war was not based on slavery, that slavery had nothing to do with this war. Not so. It had everything to do with this war. Slavery was a key issue.
And you do get visitors and reenactors who would tell you, especially on Pickett's Charge, my great-great-granddaddy fought in Pickett's Charge, but he didn't own slaves, so he wasn't fighting for slavery. In a sense, they are, in that they're fighting for the system. And the argument is made even when the Southerners talk about their freedoms. When the freedoms they're talking about is the right to own slaves and to take those slaves anywhere in the country they want to. So you can't really get away from that.
We talk about the states' rights. The states' rights that were on people's minds was whether or not we want to have the institution of slavery in our country. We talk about the economic differences between the North and the South, industrial and agrarian. The core of that is still the institution of slavery and the labor force. Either we're going to have a free market labor source, or we're going to have more of a owned system.
A lot of people can put their own individual perspective on it, but from my research and my studies, the whole basic question comes from slavery. Even if you want to say it's a states' rights issue, it's still the right to have slaves. What's the issue?
There were many that wanted that to end, and many people finally stood up and said, this really needs to end. These people are being treated inhumanely. They don't have their inalienable rights that they should have. They're not represented properly, and it's just inhumane. So let's do something about this.
We tend to think that this whole idea of slavery being the focus of the war is revisionist history. But you go back to some of the older historians like Bruce Catton and others, and they're making the argument that slavery was the central focus of the war. But that's the one point that people weren't willing to compromise on anymore.
If you look at some of the first-hand documents and you look at the reasons why the southern states were leaving, a lot of them in their secession, the reasons for seceding, it states very obviously why they are left, and they're leaving because they're afraid slavery is ending.
When you present that document, sometimes there is a light bulb or something starts, you can tell there are gears moving in somebody's mind. And at that point, just let them think, let them take that in. Because, again, they may have never known that each state had to, put out an ordinance of secession and describe why they were leaving. And if they weren't taught that, if they didn't know that that existed, then they're basing their opinions on something, and here's an opportunity to provide one more thing, and they can walk away with maybe a better understanding of what was coming.
What were these guys saying before the Civil War and during the war? And once he started to cite sources, there's not a lot of argument you can give to them.
That's the cause of their disgruntlement. It's there. It's slavery, and it's hard to argue that it's not slavery.